Hi friends, I go by the name of Host Eric, and I am the host of Talking with Famous People. This is a car musing video, possibly linking in with cognitive functions as well, but I watched a video the other day on YouTube. It was very interesting, not the other day, yesterday. It was about the redefinition of the kilogram from something that's absolutely relative to something that's relatively absolute. So, in other words, those are my terms that I use in describing validation metrics of TI and TE, respectively. Basically, you could say FI and TI, but the point is that for a long time, until fairly recently, the definition of a kilogram was the amount that this specific artifact, specific cylinder that was in this vault in Paris weighed. So they could make copies of that kilogram and make each copy weigh as close exactly as the same as that kilogram as possible, but everything was referential to that single artifact. And of course, one of the difficulties that you're faced with if you have everything referential to a single artifact like that is that it's absolutely relative. You'll be absolute in what a kilogram is, but every kilogram will be relative to that single absolute. So whether or not it's correct will be easy to determine, right? You just measure it against a single standard, and then you can have some sort of margin of error and call it either a kilogram or not. But the thing is, that's not the way we typically like to determine our standard measurements for science purposes. So when we're talking about imperial units, for example, we're talking about things that are absolutely relative. The reason I know this is 1 foot long is because I have a ruler that has 12 inches on it, and I compare it against the thing, and it's the same length. But the way they do metric, or some forms of metric, like not all, like metric has a variety of different measurements, right? From centigrade, which establishes the boiling point of water at 100 degrees and the freezing point of water at 0 degrees. So it's attempting to say, we're not going to compare against some arbitrary metric. We're going to pick something in the world that is what we might call a universal constant, you know? So it's like a meter is the distance light travels in the amount of time, I think. Or perhaps it was meow amount of the circumference of the earth. It doesn't really matter what it is. The point is that you're dealing with something in that instance that is calculable rather than measurable. And calculation and measurement are different things. Pause. Well, the thing about our so-called universal constants is that they're not actually constant. So when Einstein wrote E equals mc squared, people think, oh, well, that's great because you've got two variables, E and M, and one constant, the speed of light. Except it's not a constant in any meaningful sense, because every time we measure it, we come out with slightly different results, and we don't have any particular reason to believe that light travels the same speed through all media. In fact, we have plenty of reason to believe it doesn't. So then what are we doing there? Well, the point is that in any instance, we have to have something that stays put and other things that move. what scientists want to do is keep the thing that stays put to be something that is universally referenceable, regardless of any artifact. So it doesn't link to any specific artifact. So, in trying to determine the new weight for the kilogram, what they did was they said, look, we have this conversion equation that takes us between Avogadro's constant and Planck's constant. Avogadro's constant refers to the number of carbon atoms in like 6 grams of carbon or something, or 12 grams of carbon. I'm not exactly sure how much. So, in order to figure out exactly what Avogadro's constant is, they have to make exactly that much of a carbon ball. As perfect as down to nanometers, right? Perfect. And then when measuring Planck's constant, I'm not sure exactly what the complicated thing they did was. And the idea was that if these two independent efforts to establish each constant result in close enough equivalencies when you convert it back and forth, then we'll call that good enough, and we'll say that we can use either constant, Planck's constant or Avogadro's constant, to determine the exact weight of a kilogram. Pause. So what does all this have to do with cognitive functions? Well, one of the challenges that we face in cognitive functions is the challenge that you face in explaining anything. It's the same challenge you face in explaining anything, which is we need to have parts that don't move around. Objects of analysis, nothing else. We need to have some sort of things that remain constant. So the challenge in cognitive functions is when we want to talk about a given function as an object of analysis, we're always having to do some kind of process analysis, really, because we're not talking about something static, but rather something that operates on a time dimension in one of two distinct ways. And the thing is, we're not accustomed to thinking about time as having two forms, but it does. Okay? We're typically accustomed to thinking of time as progressing forward in a linear and steady flow of some sort, right? Or perhaps we perceive time from a more subjective perspective, like, oh, that time was flying because I was having so much fun, or time was dragging because it was so boring. But what we really have are two kinds of time. One is a fluid kind of time, which is to say we are engaging with the universe, assuming a steady, ongoing, dynamic time motion forward. And another kind of engagement with the world where we assume it's turn-based. That we can say, like, for example, this is turn-based. I'm going to make this video. You might agree or disagree with it. After I'm done making it, if you watch it, you can take your turn, put a comment. I may or may not read it, you know. I'll probably read it on this video. But I'll heart it anyway. But the only way to clear comments from your queue without responding to them, that's not relevant. Pause. You could call turn-based time communicative time and fluid time experiential time. When you're dealing with communication issues, there's an assumption that nothing's going to change while the talking is going on, right? That things are on hold. The world somehow is on hold waiting for you to finish your discussion about the matter. That's implicit to talking. It's also the case, though, that there's a more dynamic form of communication than the kind I'm doing right now, which is just action, deliberation, and then if there's going to be a response, there'll be a response after I'm all done, right? The other kind of communicative action is more dynamic, namely extroverted feeling is an interface form of communication which says I'm going to be understanding that I'm going to take some sort of communicative act, but instead of taking this big communicative act or even complete communicative act before giving the next party their turn, so to speak, if I were doing, say, stand-up comedy, I would be making jokes, reading the room on an ongoing basis, trying to work the energies of it in a more dynamic way. It would still be, however, fundamentally a turn-based kind of time, because it'll be a dynamically flavored turn-based kind of time. So they'd still be doing communication, but timing would be a lot more important in terms of whether it hits or not. And the reason for that is because when you're doing something like comedy, you're trying to have it validate on NI and or SI grounds. It's going to resonate with people's experience and therefore make them laugh, or it's going to surprise them and be clever in some way and make them laugh, So, of course, it's you're doing something that you're trying to hit on a holistic kind of success criterion, whereas if I'm explaining something like I'm explaining right now, then there's a presumption that I've made a case that's been established, and that until it's subject to rebuttal, that we would assume it's standing. So the challenge that we face in cognitive functions is the same one that scientists might face in trying to measure both the exact location and directionality of an atom or whatever at the quantum level, because there's a reality that there has to be an element of some sort of measurement, explanation, calculation, whatever, description even, maybe, I'm not sure about that one, but that stays put and one part that moves. So if you're going to measure like what direction and how fast they're accelerating in that direction something is going, then you can't be measuring exactly where it is at any given moment, because you have to be because the calculation is one of change over time rather than one of location. And for something to be statically in a specific location is for it to not be changing over time. So the challenge in cognitive functions is, how do we explain something as an object of analysis, namely like introverted intuition, what is it? Without engaging in metaphor, which is, there's a lot of reification that goes on in cognitive function talk, including by me. It's kind of unavoidable. It's just a shorthand way of saying, like, people, blah, 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 blah. But the other big challenge we have in terms of explaining things as cognitive functions is that when we do try to isolate a cognitive function as an object of analysis, we are ignoring the fact that it plays out very differently depending on what slot it's in. So we'd be pretty well served to just go like, all right, well, let's ignore 2 and 7 for a second, and we can just say that instrumentally valued functions are generally, you're going to have kind of a negative relationship with them, and absolutely valued functions, you're going to have generally a positive relationship with them. But which is to say, you're going to treat them as ends in themselves. So it could be a bad experience with it, but it's going to be important to you, right? Whereas your 4, 6, and 8, they're going to be areas of shortcomings / insecurity / counter value. Now 2 is instrumental, but you don't treat it the same way as the other instrumentals. And 7 is an absolute value, but you don't treat it the same way because Maybe you do treat them that way ultimately, but it's a lot more subtle and difficult to, like, it's hard to explain to somebody how and why exactly their tool function is not an absolute value, because it's their number one thing that they use all the time engaging in the world, and if it runs into resistance, they don't like it. But it's nevertheless not an absolute value, because ultimately they don't need the world to uphold that standard for them. Okay, well, that's enough musing. This is rather disorganized because I'm in the middle of thinking a lot of stuff out right now, but hopefully that was somewhat informative.